Roman Missal, which is the playbook for how we celebrate the Holy Eucharist, says this about the homily on Holy Thursday night. After the proclamation of the gospel, the priest gives a homily in which light is shed on the principal mysteries that are commemorated in this Mass, namely the institution of the Holy Eucharist and the priestly order, and the commandment of the Lord concerning fraternal charity. I have to admit that I find it impossible to preach about all three of these in an 8 to 12 minute homily, and so I usually emphasize just one of them. And if the truth be told, I probably most often emphasize the commandment of the Lord concerning fraternal charity, which we emphasize here at JP2 by allowing anyone who wishes to have their feet washed and then to wash someone else's feet. But this year, being the year of the Eucharistic revival, I want to talk tonight specifically about the first of those, the institution of the Holy Eucharist. In chapter 6 of John's Gospel, it contains what we Catholics call the bread of life discourse. This is where Jesus proclaims himself to be the bread of life on 5 different occasions. It begins, however, with the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. And John begins this story with these words: Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs that he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. It's that last sentence that I want to begin with today. John points out that the Jewish feast of Passover was near. The early Christians, most of whom were Jews, saw a deep connection between what happened on Holy Thursday and Good Friday. They saw a deep connection with that and the Passover. For them, the Passover was the old covenantal sacrifice, and Jesus' Last Supper on Holy Thursday and his death on Good Friday was the new covenantal sacrifice. And that's what I want to look at tonight. Once again, I do all this because as we come to understand better the Eucharist, it helps us to see the incredible beauty that God has given us in this great gift of the Eucharist. So John points out that the Jewish feast of Passover was near. All the Gospels connect the Last Supper with the feast of Passover. It's interesting that Jesus doesn't connect this action he is about to perform to the Jewish Feast of Atonement. He doesn't connect it to Hanukkah, not the Feast of Booths, nor even the Jewish New Year. He connects it to the Feast of Passover. So let's take a look at how he does that, and more importantly, why he does that. To understand the Feast of Passover, we have to understand a little bit about Jewish history, so bear with me for just a moment. The end of the book of Genesis tells how the Israelites, the Jewish people, end up in Egypt. A famine happens in Israel, and many Jews go to Egypt in search of food. Once in Egypt, the Israelites keep increasing in numbers until one of the kings of Egypt, called Pharaoh, decides that they're getting too big and enslaves them. Then the Pharaoh decides they're getting too big, and he kills all the baby boys. One Hebrew woman attempts to save her baby by placing him in a basket and shipping him down the Nile River. Pharaoh's daughter saves him and raises him in her own house. That baby, of course, would be Moses. And as an adult, Moses is commanded by God to convince the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. 10 times the Pharaoh refuses, and after each refusal, God sends a plague, the final plague being the death of the firstborn of all the Israelites. The Israelites are instructed how to spare their children, however. This is recounted in chapter 12 of the book of Exodus. We just read it tonight. Each household is to sacrifice a young lamb without blemish. The blood of the lamb is placed on the doorpost so that the angel of death will pass over the houses with the blood on the doorpost. That is how the Israelites are to be spared. They are saved by the blood of the Lamb. And then God gives Moses this instruction: "You will keep this practice as a perpetual institution for yourselves and your descendants. Thus, when you have entered the land which the Lord will give you as he promised, you must observe this rite. When your children ask you, 'What does this rite mean?' you'll reply, 'It is a Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt. When he struck down the Egyptians, he delivered our houses.'" The original Passover, the old sacrifice, saved the Jewish people. The new Passover, the new sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, saves us. Now here's what the Jewish people teach about the Passover. This comes from the Mishnah, which is the ritual instructions for Jewish liturgies. In every generation, a man must regard himself as if he came forth from Egypt. In other words, for the Jews of Jesus' time, the Passover was not just a memorial meal. It was a way, in a sense, of transporting themselves back to the time and reliving the experience once again of the Exodus from Egypt, and they do it every year. But now when Jesus celebrated the Passover meal with his disciples on that Holy Thursday night, he broke with tradition. He takes the unleavened bread and he says, "Take, eat, this is my body for you." And with the cup he says, "This is the cup of my blood, of the new covenant, which will be poured out for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And I'm pretty sure that the disciples questioned this. I'm sure they wondered, why is he messing with this Passover text? This all took place on Holy Thursday night. And then the very next day, Jesus fulfills it when he literally gives his body for us, when he literally pours out his blood for us. The Passover then was not just a meal, it was a sacrifice. And this Mass that we celebrate today is not just a communal meal, it is a sacrifice of Jesus on the cross made real for us each and every time we celebrate it. It is Holy Thursday and it's Good Friday wrapped all together in the sacrifice of the Mass. The early church, once again, most of whom were Jews, understood this immediately. St. Paul, writing just 30 years after the ascension of Jesus, 1 Corinthians 5, 7-8, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." It was the lamb, innocent and without blemish, that was sacrificed at Passover. Paul is saying that Jesus was sacrificed just like the Passover lamb. And we acknowledge this at every Mass when we say 3 times, "Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us." Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world, grant us peace. And then I'll say, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those called to the supper of the Lamb." 4 times in the Mass, we recognize Jesus as our Passover lamb. This is what we read from St. Paul tonight. The Lord gives us his body and blood, and then St. Paul writes, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaimed the Lord's death until he comes again." And so we hear about the Eucharist very soon after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. And the early church fathers tell us what the church believed about the Eucharist. St. Ignatius of Antioch, writing in the 2nd century, states this about the Eucharist: "I take no pleasure in corruptible food or in the delights of this life. I want the bread of God, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, who is the seed of David. And for drink, I want his blood, which is incorruptible love." St. Cyril of Jerusalem repeats this in the 4th century. "Therefore, do not consider them as mere bread and wine, for according to the declaration of the Master, they are his body and blood." This is the earliest tradition of the church. In fact, it has always been what the church believed. Churches that have a symbolic or metaphorical understanding of Jesus' words, "This is my body, this is my blood," those thoughts only began to take hold after the 16th century, after the Protestant Reformation. But we as Catholics have always held the Eucharist to be Jesus, body and blood, soul and divinity. My friends, each time we celebrate the Eucharist, we celebrate the sacrifice of Jesus on Calvary, which is the fulfillment of what we did tonight. It's the fulfillment of those words, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it. This is my body. Take this, all of you, and drink of it. This is my blood. This is my body. This is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me."